how today is going to go is we have a topic. The topic is soft skills, and we're going to have subtopics. And I'm going to start off by asking someone to volunteer and tell us who they are and what attracted them to this lab. If they have any questions that they want to make sure that they leave with answers to, we'll get them up on the board. If there are any like major points that you're like, I can't leave until everybody knows this thing, let's put it up on the board and we'll address this as the conversation develops. This also helps me be very responsive to what's in the what the concerns are, with what the wants and needs are of you all. Would anybody like to start? So I'll start. I'm John Martin, and I run the Active Teaching Lab. And in my doctoral work in School of Education and Curriculum Instruction, I was really very much focused on content acquisition. Like, how do we teach subject to student? And through that graduate, master's, and PhD process, I really flipped that all around and recognized that the social skills are so much more interesting. The motivation, if we can get them motivated, we really don't have to worry about teaching because they'll figure it out on their own. So in many ways, the soft skills, the idea that we only, as instructors over the last 100 years, and the focus was more on K-12, but I think it applies towards graduate school as well, or undergraduate and graduate school, higher ed. Typically, 75% of what we grade on, as we instructors, vaguely speaking, are those non-academic skills. So the 25% is, do they do well on the tests? And the rest is, do they show up? Do they participate? Are they jerks to the people that they're sitting next to? Things like that. And there's a lot to be said about those non-academic skills in our disciplines. Right? We want people to know the content, but also know how to get along with other people so that they're not all working in silos, so that they can work together and do better things together. So that's sort of my interest in this. And I want to, I guess, look at motivation and how do we motivate people to not just go with the academic skills, but also for those other things. And how can we purposely design those in as instructors? Jessica, Kenny, either one of you is next.
I can go. I'm Jessica, and I'm academic staff in the Biological Systems Engineering Department. I'm specifically interested today. We do a lot of group work in our classes, and I'm just looking for techniques to maybe have the students get more out of that group work. It's like they don't really like to talk to people they don't know, and there's a lot less back and forth than I would like during group work.
All right. Yeah, they don't talk. Jerry.
Excuse me, hi, I'm Jerry Dreyer. I'm a graduate student in educational leadership and policy analysis. I'm just endlessly fascinated by both social learning and educational technology and how they fit and don't fit.
Yeah. I'll put that down as fit. Good. Lincoln.
I'm Megan Powder. I teach at the med school, and think ultimately that these students are going to have to work in teams, so I was trying to, find out different ways that we can promote that.
Teamwork, yeah, good.
Eric Girola, I'm enrolled at the CDW. I do some, a lot of clinical teaching, but now some also pre-clinical teaching, so I'm just kind of absorb whatever I can absorb.
Okay.
Here.
Well, let's talk about the difference between group work or these sort of skills in clinical versus traditional education, because I bet that the students that you run into are very much focused on the academic side of things. No? Maybe? Yeah, okay. That'd be interesting to talk about.
So I'm Dolly. I'm an instruction designer at enroll. I'm just interested in what the technologies could be used for social processes.
Okay, great. Margaret?
Hi, I'm Margaret. I work with John in Active Teaching Lab and support this and other instructional design activities.
I'm Jennifer. I'm a project assistant with the Active Teaching Lab, and I'm interested in if and how we can use technology to build group camaraderie faster than usually the time it takes to do it in person.
Ooh. Good.
I'm Peter Van Cannon, faculty in the kinesiology department. My area is neuroscience, and I've been kind of experimenting these last couple of years with, more social engagement in the classroom, and a lot of teaching, a lot of teamwork assignments, and I think once people get used to different ways of doing things, they start to appreciate, and they start to see the differences between, what's required once they graduate, like in terms of solving problems and thinking critically about things, as opposed to, what they have done in the last 4 years that they were here, for example, in an undergraduate career, and have gotten used to a particular method of being graded on stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is kind of like, people get used to a certain way of getting their grades, and that might not necessarily be the best way for preparing them for their future careers.
My name's Kenny. I'm a TA in the Kines department, and I'm just interested if there are, John doesn't like the word best practices, so good practices when it comes to integrating soft skill into learning experiences.
I use the phrase emerging good practices. Yes. Best sounds like it's so set, right? Like we know. And what we know is, all right, we're not doing too much harm here, so that's good. Maybe it's not best yet. Thank you. Should we start off by talking about, so what are the attitudes of students when it comes to, or should we start somewhere earlier? What do we think about this idea that how, as you look back at your own teaching and the teaching and learning that you've undergone, how much of it would you say aligns with what the research, and there's a research paper by Bowers in 2016, I think. I actually have it here. On what do teacher assigned grades measure? And this is just like the one-page summary of a much bigger chunk of research. It says that it's really, the grades and test scores that consistently remain moderately correlated at 0.5%, 0.5, indicating that 24% of the variance is attributed to fundamental academic knowledge. But what is the other 75? So what is the other 75? What are our thoughts on this? As you grade, as you've gone through learning, what did you see was important? What did you feel was important? What do your students think is important?
Taking skills.
Test taking skills, right? It's the number one question. Is this on the test? And how do there's always this game to figure out, what does the instructor want as the right answer? What will they accept as the right answer? So there's a lot of, students in many ways think of this as a game, as education as a game, where they need to figure out what are the things that I need to focus on and what are the things that I don't need to focus on. How much of what they need to focus on is the right answer and applying the right answer and doing that, and how much of it are the things like participation, showing up. What are the some of the things that they talk about here. But also for student persistence, behavior, participation, and effort. And these are arguably not the things that we usually focus on when we make an assignment. Do we think about how, as one of my learning outcomes, that they're going to be more persistent? It might be subconsciously, but rarely do we say, today you're going to learn how to fail, and get back up. Today you're going to learn how to work with other people that you might not really like, but you someday are going to have to work with people that you might not like. So we're going to practice here. How do we formalize? Should we formalize these things, or should we leave it as part of the?
Are you suggesting that we just make a learning objective that is in the syllabus that says you are going,
So this is the question. What do we think? Is that
Yeah.
Joe?
Well, I think a lot of the work that we expect students to do is like really summative. We're just asking them to produce an artifact or a top or something.
Yep.
A lot of that kind of gaming mentality comes from that. What is that about? Like people are trying to get it right the first time, which maybe is not authentic knowledge, right? And so can we design our experiences so they're more formative and iterative, where they might do many versions of something, where they might get many different levels of feedback of something, where they potentially are going to fail multiple times.
And not even potentially fail, but can we set it up so that they know what failure looks like, so they can understand the fail side of the system that we're trying to teach, and then they also know what the success side of the system is, and then they can play around in that problem space.
One thing, especially in the clinical sphere, right? I do this all the time, which is I assign each student. So I teach an ICU, and each student has one patient, and I tell them.
Simulation patient?
No, real patient.
Real patient. Okay, so you don't want them to fail necessarily.
Well, I do actually. So I assign each a patient. I tell them to begin with, like, I expect you to know nothing. I know you know nothing. You start off with a grade of F. You work your way up to A. By just trial and error. So as long as you try, I'm okay with that. And what I have them do, also, like I have them work with teams. So I say you're now a part of the team. Just talk to the nurse. The nurse, by the patient, they're almost, they're many hours more than you are. So you're expected to talk to them, right?
Learn from them, yeah.
I expect you to put in orders. Now, these orders don't get, on patient plans, they don't get done because it's a med student, so they have to be co-signed. But I said to them, you start putting orders, that way I know what you're thinking. And don't worry, you're not going to kill the patient because it's not going to be signed unless I approve it.
Okay, good.
And so, I do this in the clinical sphere. Question is, how do you put this in the preclinical side?
Yeah, so you're already doing it at that level. Other examples of people who do it in your classroom, or have you seen it done? Did you experience it as a student yourself?
Well, in our labs, we give formative questions. We have the lecture in the morning and then a lab right after, and we have formative questions where we go around to our small lab groups and just ask them something fairly high level that they, probably an hour ago are like, I don't know about, but we have them talk through the problem and, describe kind of what they think, and it's been helpful because it shows us where they're at and what kind of prep work they've done. But it also is, if they tell me totally wrong answer, it's nope, it's okay. But what if you thought about it this way, or so it's more in kind of the language we use, but just helping them get to the next step.
And one of the ways that you're doing that is you said you go to the small group. So as a group they answer, or somebody in the group answers for the group, or they discuss and come to a consensus.
Right. Yeah, we give them we just hand out the questions at the beginning and then come back. So they'll have had time, or maybe have had an hour to think about the question, and then we come and check on them and see what they think.
So there's a lot of social learning that's sort of happening there, where they're teaching each other, they're arguing on certain things.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you're building you're not just building, the opportunity for them to fail, but you're also building the opportunity for them to collaborate, to learn from each other, some of these other soft skills that Bowers mentioned.
Yeah, but we don't explicitly say, it's more,
Right.
we tell them that they're practice questions or challenges that we give them. So, but no, we never explicitly say, this is a team building exercise, this is a formative exercise.
Yeah, or for this purpose, because someday you're going to have to be working in teams and groups. And I'm hearing that you do actually make that explicit.
Yes, I do. And so my main strategy has been based on what's formalized as team-based learning. They have a website, teambasedlearning.org. And so one of the techniques they use is they provide an individual test. So people would make a number of questions, answer them individually, and then right afterwards you have the team, and there's a team 5 to 7 people, and they are forming a team, and that stays the same throughout the semester, throughout the course duration. So what happens is automatically, when the team takes the same questions, answers the same questions as the individual has answered immediately before, is that there's discussion. Like nobody can hide. Everybody can say, well, like I thought it was this, and then somebody else says, well, no, I thought it was this, and then, well, why? What accounts for the difference? And so you get automatic, error correction and initiative. That I'm not necessarily as instructor involved in the discussions of the team. I'm just walking around and seeing how they do. And so they're more freely in terms of expressing their opinions and, discussing actual topic material that way. And I think that has been, successful. But what it does require is, it's like an open attitude of the students, to kind of like say, well, the era of studying for a midterm and a final and then be done and then you have a grade, that's over, and so a lot of people think, it's like, that's what I'm used to, and that's what I've been good at. Why should I put in all this extra work and go through team discussions and this and that, why is it necessary? And so to me, the critical point is to be able to sell it, to be able to say, okay, well, we're doing it this way because it prepares you better for what comes afterwards. Like if you want to solve a problem, then, like you're going to have to work with other people to find the solutions. And so this is kind of like a simulation of that. So it's quite similar to what you say and what you say, actually, in terms of, having to work with other people to figure out whether you did it correctly or incorrectly and why.
Just this morning, I read an article about how in so much of the world in the, I'm probably going to say this wrong. Certainly in Western countries, a lot has been done, a lot has been focused on what can I do by myself. I have an idea, I'll start a company, I'll make something happen, and boom, I've got something. But at this point, systems have gotten so complex that you cannot do, we just don't have the ability to do this by ourselves. And in some ways, I'm wondering if that is driving this move towards team-based collaborative thinking where we have to get into cross-disciplinary teams, and I'll bring my area of specialty and you bring your area of specialty, and together we can make something more complex. And I wonder, there may not be any correlation between this at all, but we are seeing more of this with the active teaching and, active learning. I just brought up the Wisconsin experience thing. The idea of teaching empathy and humility, the idea of teaching relentless curiosity, intellectual confidence, and purposeful action probably wouldn't have been talked about at the university level, in any university, even 20 years ago. Intellectual confidence would have probably, right? Because that's the one that's, you'll leave with the skills to be able to do that. But empathy and humility is sort of, in some ways, opposite of intellectual confidence, where I come in and say, I have the answers, right? This is like, I have some answers in some area, but I need your help as well to figure that out. And therefore, I'm curious to find out what you know and what we can all put together and make out of this in order to solve a purposeful a problem that is too complex for the rest of us. So you can do this in face-to-face groups. How can we do this in discussions and in the online spaces? I don't need to think about that just for a second. I'm going to see somebody's. Lauren. All right. Okay. So this is why we wanted to do this. We've got another person there, Lauren. We don't see your picture, but you're somewhere around there. Lauren is a PhD student in planning and landscape and architecture, interested in using online teaching to build peer networks among people that work in the same areas. Farmers market managers that are distributed across the area. And no other questions, but I want to try to check in. If she has a question, can you make a big signal, because I might not be able to see it otherwise.
Yeah, I think you saw her.
Excellent. Great, thank you. I have to figure out how to do this better and more smoothly, so thank you all for that interruption. One of the things I don't want to do is focus entirely on face-to-face so that I lose or that becomes an afterthought, but I also don't want to interrupt everything. So I don't know how to do this yet, but we're learning. Can we do this in the online spaces, in discussion forums? So Peter, when you talk to your students and you say, here's why we're doing this, here's why you need to do that, are you giving them any other explicit instruction? You also teach online courses, as I recall. And are you doing this in those discussion areas as well?
I am actually. And so I kind of developed an online version of this that stretches out over a couple of days. And so I couple it to a discussion board so people can actually, asynchronous talk
Right.
to one another about problems. And the success rate is not quite as high as, in a face-to-face environment, in that, the teams that get it are doing really well, but there's also teams that don't get it and that kind of like, don't offer the information that would be, useful to other team members necessarily. So I'm gonna have to work on that some more, to figure out how to do that better. But I think it can be done in the online space.
The technology aspect, and Jerry, you introduced yourself with this curiosity of how can technology help social learning and how can it sometimes not work in those spaces. And I think there's something that's wonderful about asynchronous discussions in that it doesn't put you on the spot necessarily. In a face-to-face group instruction, there's almost this pressure to like, somebody has to say something, so I'll just blurt out something that might not make sense. And if I'm introverted, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to hold it and somebody else will blurt something out, and whatever thought that I had sometimes gets run over and ignored because I don't have a chance to express it. In an asynchronous online discussion, I can look at what I have to say, think about it, double check it, and then hit submit. But in a face-to-face, there's that pressure to like, okay, we have to do something. And maybe forcing us to have to say something right away is part of what makes it successful, that we put out these unfinished thoughts and we rely on the rest of the group to sort of say, I see a kernel of something there, let me add to it and build on that.
We've tried to make so the Canvas discussion board has its own issues, but.
Wouldn't it be great if there were a perfect tool to make
I
these
know.
we've easier?
We've tried using Piazza before too,
Yep.
and I am not as good at using that one, and we've gone in and out, we're gonna try and use it again, but we thought it made the student, discussion board comments more student focused, because we encourage them first to have a student answer a question before we did. There's the thing on Piazza that's like the thumbs up from the instructor, so then it makes my job easier, and I just go think, yes, this is great, but, I guess that helped, but we had technology issues, that's actually more why we stopped using it for a couple of years, but.
Piazza is a really interesting tool. Is everybody familiar with it? It is a discussion forum tool that allows wiki-style answers. So you pose as an instructor, really, they encourage what they call wicked problems, problems that don't have really easy answers, that your students wouldn't be able to figure out for sure, right? Unless they work together and figure it out. One of your students proposes an answer, the next person goes in and builds on that answer, and eventually they start going down a path that the instructor can come in, as Megan says, and say, you're on the right path, or come in and say, try, getting warmer, but try this, move this direction, and so on. It was developed, the origin story of this tool is amazing, I think. In India, an engineering female student looked around and saw that all of her male counterparts were working together solving problems, but because of the culture, they would not let her into the group because males and females, unmarried, can't talk. I don't know the whole culture, but there was a thing that she had to solve these problems on her own, and the men were all working together solving the problems. So she's like, let's build a tool where I'm anonymous and I can go in and either as an anonymous person, I can ask in today's world, it allows students to go in and say, I don't have a good understanding of this. I'm going to ask a dumb question. They can do that without outing themselves as having a dumb question, right?
Yeah, and that's the anonymous feature. Because you can set it so they're totally anonymous or that they're just anonymous to the class. That actually helped a lot. The last time we did this, we had that everybody seemed to do it anonymously, but there was always one student who's an excellent student and always answered everybody's questions, but they always set themselves as anonymous because I think they just didn't want to be seen as like a know-it-all or something like that.
So the students, when they do have the right thing, they can start building the sort of social capital as come to me for resources. I have, look at me, I'm smart, I'm clever, love me.
I think I'm in a class right now with an instructor that does a great job of posting questions on Canvas that we're going to talk about the next day in class. But it's a chance for people to kind of pre-think it a little bit, which I think helps with shyness. Some people don't talk, but they ever in class, but their responses, they're very thoughtful. They do it, especially I think for international students too, who for English might be a second or third language, might be less confident speaking, but they'll write or they can take their time. It also doesn't have to be writing too. Sometimes we post memes or other stuff, or just links to something else. Like there's other ways to communicate besides our own direct ideas. We can appropriate things or whatever. So I think those are really helpful.
And I think that's a brilliant way to let the students lead in many ways, because if an instructor goes and finds a meme, it's not going to be cool. But if the students go find the memes, they will find some good ones. And you know that anytime you have student curated content, they will curate the content based on, is it the right answer? And does it reflect me and my personality right? And does it, does it make me look smart or whatever? So oftentimes they will pour through hundreds of options to try to find the one that is right for them. And in sorting through that, they're doing high-level Bloom's taxonomy stuff, analyzing, synthesizing, is this the right one? Is this the right, they have to understand it, they have to remember it. They're curating content is a really fun way to do it, especially with memes, because that's a language that younger students, kids these days are speaking.
It's also a good assessment for the instructor because they come into class, they already know what people are thinking about. They can take the competition kind of continues off of that.
Yeah,
right?
You don't have to start off with, where are we?
I saw people talking about this. What about that? Talk about that more. Explain that. And then it fills out.
That's an excellent point.
It works really well.
Feedback is so important, both for students, but it's also for instructors, right? So if I know where everybody is, we can go on from there. If I have no idea, I have to start at the bottom. And does everybody get that? I don't know. So I'm just going to play it safe and not go as far in the directions that are important for us. Side note on Piazza, I did a survey of 94 physiology seniors and asked them several questions. What advice they'd give to themselves 4 years ago as they were starting. What are their best tech-enabled assignments and activities? And Piazza came out very highly rated there because even though this was a big thing, it has sort of a 1980s interface to it. It looks very outdated, and maybe they'll get to that someday. But it works really well in stripped down and simple way. It works really well. If you have good questions, they respond to it. If you just use it for dumb stuff and make them do busy work, then it doesn't make sense. But they love the idea that they can ask those questions without both ways, anonymous and non-anonymous. And it's not anonymous to the instructor. So you always know who, if there's anybody saying something that needs to be addressed, you can address it. Jessica, you talked about group work for non-talkers. So you're talking about face-to-face groups.
Yeah. Just trying to get people to, tends to be, you walk around the classroom, there's usually one person really driving a discussion, sometimes in a nice and helpful way, and sometimes in a just like, I want to get out of this classroom, I know what I'm doing, railroading kind of way. And
Yeah, because if I know what I'm doing and I focus and I'm with the rest of the group that doesn't know what I'm doing or what they're doing, and it's like, as soon as we get done with this, I can leave. I'm just going to say, here's the answer, here's the next answer, here's the next answer. And it's not so much about let me explain the answer to you, but it's more of let's just get this exercise done so I can go out and enjoy the afternoon or whatever. So how do we handle that? Do you do any assessment?
essentially what I do is I just, you can kind of see when it's happening and I just interject myself into those groups, but it would be nice if they could kind of, the same person continues to do it, so how do you break those cycles?
And Peter does that too. You wander around and you listen in. I have a real hard time doing that. I try it and I'll hear 2 words here, but not enough to get the context of what's going on. And if I sit here and join the group, that's really awkward for the group, but I'm also like with half an ear trying to hear what's going on in the other group. So that's a really hard thing for me to do.
But I think what makes one difference in this respect is to have the same people work as a team for the entire semester. And so they, it creates, kind of like an atmosphere of psychological safety, of being able to speak and listen in proportion to one another. At least that's what that's what I tell them beforehand, kind of like that's one of my objectives that you would achieve within a team, that everybody kind of has, the same time listening as opposed to talking, and people be respectful of one another, and it seems to work in general. There are some exceptions, but the exceptions are very rare actually. Because over the time, people get used to each other. And
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, even if you have a large course, it's kind of like a little neighborhood feeling, and so it's the first line of defense. So
It becomes a safer
right.
neighborhood. I like that. It's like, these are the people on my block.
Yeah, exactly. And once that happens, then you'll see people do not, have the behavior that you just described, because it doesn't feel right, if you have a circle of friends, to be dominating all the time and to say, well, this is how it's going to be done because I know what I'm doing. You know, and so it's a mindset, I think, that once people get it, they can relate to it. And they enjoy it, you know, but even the people that don't enjoy it in the beginning of the semester, kind of, you know, and that express their reservations at that time. I said, well, you know, stick with it and see what you think, you know. And in most cases, at the end of the semester, you know, they even come and say, well, I didn't think it was going to work this well, but I got it, you know, I have to say, it was enjoyable, you know, and I learned a lot. So, I mean, that's kind of like what we aim for.
Right.
So,
You want it to be uncomfortable and yet make it valuable enough that they appreciate it
that's right,
afterwards.
that's right. There's a purpose behind structuring things.
Does anyone work with roles where you assign roles?
So I think sometimes having structure, like giving people a structure of how to interact with each other, is helpful sometimes. And you can scaffold that, and you can give, like that's one of the things we're teaching. You can give different examples each class session. You can have structures where certain people take turns talking for a specified amount of time, and you can keep time in the class. And people have a role to respond or not to respond, sometimes just to listen. You can play with that in a lot of different ways. Kind of model that for people, they have a chance. I think another thing is type of task you give people. If the task is too big, that's when people become more, when the perceived stakes are really high, that's when people become more reactionary and more defensive. So I think you have to be careful about how you roll those tasks out over time, and you start small, where the stakes are low, they have a chance to develop that neighborhood before they're fighting a fire.
Right.
Right, and then they build up to that, where, you know, later on they have the skills to like take that on.
Even in a single discussion activity, I think that you can have multiple, you know, start off with something simple. Good, we got that done, that was easy. Move on to the next challenge, it's a little bit harder. Okay, we spent a little bit more time. Maybe you don't get to all four, maybe you only get to 3 of the 4, but 1 was a gimme, 2 was sort of easy-ish, 3 was sort of really starting to get into the challenge of it. And, you know, maybe 4 is in case you have somebody who knows everything about it, they can't leave because 4 is too complicated to be able to actually finish. You've all heard this. Kenny.
Sorry. So one of the things I did in the Delta internship, we talked about constructive and destructive group behaviors and just being made aware of, so in our activity, we had to pick 1 constructive and 1 destructive that we would identify with. And so constructive behaviors included cooperating, clarifying, inspiring, harmonizing, risk-taking, process checking. You can kind of get into a little bit of roles there, but then destructive was dominating, rushing, withdrawing, discounting, digressing, blocking. And so I think when we kind of talked it and shared within our groups, you know, here's what we identified with and try and come up with strategies to mitigate, especially those destructive group behaviors while promoting the constructive ones. So I thought it was just interesting, you know, I think just some self-awareness helps as well.
And that,
It's great to name them, give them names.
Right.
Like label.
yeah.
Right. I think that's one of the things we came up with, like just having a name for it.
And in some ways, this sounds like the idea of, we know that the more you can give students agency in their learning, the more they feel like it's their learning, the more ownership they'll take of it. So things like having the students come up with a contract, or what are the rules for discussions at the beginning of the course, so that throughout the course, these aren't imposed rules necessarily. And sometimes you need imposed rules, right? You need to give out the explicit rules, but giving them an opportunity to come up with their own rules might be a really good way to, one, some of the groups might say, you know, I'm really good at skill X, so I'm going to come at it and I want to develop it more. That's my area of specialty that I'd like to graduate and be the best in the world at. So I'm going to look at things from this perspective and build off of that. Many of you have heard this already if you've been to my labs before, but especially for controversial topics. I'll say, okay, your job is to be the author advocate, whatever the author says, whether you agree or not, you have to agree with it, find 2 more pieces of outside information to bring to it, and you're that expert. You're the devil's advocate. Whatever the author says, they're wrong. You have to find the opposite point, whether you agree or not, bring it 2 pieces. You're the mediator. You need to know what the advocate and devil's advocate say, where's the third way? What can we do where we can all get along, or and find more information. And Eric, your job is to be the troll, the online troll. You get to go in and just sort of badmouth everybody. Now, of course, we know that you're not really a jerk. You just have to wear that role today, and because of the audience, it's a role. So whether you are or not, you're playing that role. And you can bring in, but you also have to show that you know what's happening here. So you're not going to, just by the nature of we're in a class, this is a social situation, I'm not going to be a real jerk like an online anonymous troll, but I can have fun with that role. And it's kind of your week to have the bye or to be out. And then the next week we switch. Now you're the troll, you're the author advocate, you're the devil's advocate, you're the mediator. And you do that 4 times. Everybody's clear defined roles. They all think of it from different perspectives. They have arguments. They learn hopefully how to respond to people who disagree with them, either based on good evidence or just rudely. And it's those are good non-academic skills to have in any profession. In academics, for sure, right? We set up proposals and journal articles, and we get peer reviews back, and some of them are kind and some of them are less kind, and we have to be professional and have arguments and then go have coffee with our colleagues afterwards. So that's a good skill to have.
Are people familiar with Game Jam format? I just learned this last semester and I found it really endlessly fascinating. And it's a structure for additive conversations. So you have a design problem, and the expectation is you get into small groups that are randomly assigned. You come up with a rapid prototype. The expectation is it's rough. It's just like whatever you can come up with in 20 minutes. We're talking about video games here, right? So people just come up with these really rapid prototypes, and they present them, no visuals. You just have to answer like 4 kind of criteria. This is how it does this. This is how it does this. You describe that to the group, and then a facilitator asks questions, but your group cannot answer the questions. All the other teams have to answer the questions about your prototype. So they're adding on to it. It's like the facilitator says, how does this work? Your group doesn't get to say anything. The other teams have to kind of conceptualize how that happens and add on to your idea. So you go through this, and then you change groups based on the affinity for different designs. So it's like, well, I really like what that group has going on. I'm going to join them. Maybe people in that group are dissatisfied. You just reshuffle, and you just go through iterations of this over and over and over and over again. You just keep adding on, adding on. So it's very constructive. Instead of people saying that won't work, that's a terrible idea, people try to figure out how it does work.
Yeah.
And people are free to also have agency. They make choices. They can move back and forth.
Well, I love the idea that the original group can't answer the questions,
Right.
so other people have to, jump in and say, I see it going this way, or whatever. So it does become this, and they wouldn't say that otherwise, because they'd be like, well, that's their job. They're the group. They take the ownership. I'll just ask questions or listen.
People really wind up extending their ideas. They're like, wow, we didn't think that.
I love that.
That's fast. That's perfect. Great. Or whatever. It's really cool.
And in the end, you might have a really terrible thing that's a lot of fun, or was fun to create. So you probably have to go back in and say, all right, what is this fantasy thing that we've done? How does it now fit with what we're trying to learn? What are the parts of the system that match, and what are the parts of the system that don't match? Which is a good part of synthesis. When you said game jam, I was thinking of a different thing altogether, actually having students design video games or design board games and short little prototypes. And we've done that several times as a first day activity for classes. you get stuck in a group with 5 people, you've got an hour to make a game, and you need to very quickly figure out, what do we do, what works, what doesn't work, how am I going to work with these people, 4 strangers that I don't know, and by the end of it, you usually have things figured out, and the rest of the semester that was like one of my most successful semesters was when I did that with the freshmen. All right, have any new questions come up? Are there any things that we haven't talked about here? I guess we didn't. Let's just go through real quick and revisit. For motivation, there's something about agency, right? When we get the students involved in making decisions, either coming up with what are the constructive, destructive things, adding extra things based on their affinity and interests, that triggers those intrinsic motivations so that they see, or that authentic learning of, this is going to be useful for me in the future. Okay, that'll help you with the motivation of it. Group work for non-talkers, we didn't really talk about non-talkers other than sort of forcing them to take a role in a face-to-face situation. Another way to think about that is you can have them document. Somebody can document in a Google Doc, in a Word doc, or whatever, in a Canvas discussion forum or assignment, have them document what they're doing. And the non-talkers might be the ones that will take the helm with the keyboard, and they will be able to add stuff into it that others can see and work with, but it gives them an opportunity to think about things visually before they speak it out auditorily. So that's one option. Social learning and teaching, I think that actually just builds on that. There's a lot of advantages that technology gives us that we never had before. You had to be a talker. You had to be extroverted in the past in order to survive the game of schooling, where you had to recite things and you had to take initiative and speak up. And now we can have more thoughtful, I don't want to say more thoughtful, but people who think in different ways, and they can be part of the conversation discourse as well. Eric talked a little bit about the clinical situation, and they are able to make those mistakes, but we didn't really talk about preclinical opportunities there. And I'm thinking that simulations is one of the ways to do that. And actually, like games is well, actually, Megan, you do a lot of this in the preclinical situation.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on how it can be done?
They have the clinical skills sessions, but those are very, short period actions.
Taste and not enough time.
I know that.
And that's what we're up against in many
Yeah.
ways for a lot of this social learning.
I think, well, with the nursing school, that was that's very cool. Yeah. What it is, use it out.
Yes.
See where you could do something very much like the clinical work you described, like online. You have students pose the problems, even, and have a longer discussion about it. It's totally low stakes, it's just fiction.
Yeah, Piazza again would be a good one. And Piazza is much easier now because it's integrated into Canvas, so they don't have to. It's not you have to log in or create a new account somewhere else. You're logged into Canvas. You got a direct link to Piazza, although it does look a little old. Can we speed up social learning? That was Jennifer's, or not social learning. Can we speed up the skill acquisition through technology? I don't know. You can do group work without having to physically meet up with a group. So in some ways, you're saving the scheduling, and you're saving a lot of the walking down to meet at the library and room, whatever. Or so there is that. You can have not just one meeting, but we'll have multiple meetings throughout a week because it's just a matter of getting onto my phone and talking to each other. So I think that there is possibilities there. Doing it often, making it as a routine so that it becomes the regular expected thing, I think is one of the biggest elements of success. Initially, when they first do it, they're not going to like it, right? Because they just want you to give them what they need to know. But if you make them do it, they'll hate it. You make them do it again. You make them do it a third time. Okay, I can start to figure out how this is valuable. And eventually, at the end of the semester, wow, who knew? So that's good.
I think and making the early stuff low stakes.
Yes.
Like a better way to get them to buy into it.
Yeah. I mean, one important common element to it, to all the approaches that we've talked about is that, it's the process rather than the product.
Yeah.
That provides the learning opportunities. And so the learning happens, whenever the interaction happens. It's not just like taking a test at the end or whatever, but, it's kind of like, people are interacting with one another and learning from each other.
It's life.
That's right.
So much of learning traditionally has been in this sterile classroom with white walls, and we work individually, and we're not allowed to talk to each other, and it's a very individualistic thing. This is switching that on its head and saying, no, these things are really important. Let's acknowledge and figure out how to do them. Any other questions? Thanks for coming, Megan. I know you got to go. All right. On your way out, if you could just take that blue sheet. I'll get you one. What do you have on
I
that?
don't have one.
And just check a couple boxes. On the very bottom of the sheet, there's an opportunity to say, hey, I'd love to see a lab on topic, whatever topic you want to do. So if you see something or if you think a conversation, discussion like this would be good on a topic that we have not talked about yet, that'd be great. Thank you all for coming, and Lauren, thank you for watching online.